Larisa Meeks unexpectedly became the keeper of 2 purple pincher hermit crabs when her pastor's daughters chose her to take their pets as they were about to move out of state, a mere 300 days ago. Since September, she added a saucer, increased the crab habitat from 20 gallons to 55 gallons, added an upright wheel, and filtered pools. She adopted 4 captive bred babies from Crab Central Station in November. By Christmas, she had added 2 25-gallon toppers. It is the main focal point in her living room now. Shello, Hermie, Bonaventure, Fitzroy, Francis Albert, and Cosmo are thriving in the new crab habitat called Crab Key, named after Pastor Key's family. Completely unfamiliar with hermit crabs before, Larisa quickly became an advocate not only for the animals, but also for the children and families that were being misinformed and lied to. The worst thing she heard from children was that they were told hermit crabs don't poop. Absolutely the opposite of science. Larisa and her husband Bobby have a blended family with 5 grown children. She homeschooled their children for 9 years and continued to help with a local co-op for another 4 years. In addition to children's Bible study, she has helped students with a variety of science courses, family living, and study skills. She enjoys crafts, miniature making, and classic movies. Her other pets include 2 dogs, a cat, a bearded dragon, a rescue squirrel, a fancy rat, 2 jumping spiders, and a sea monkey colony. Please welcome Larisa Meeks.
Starter Pets, the unlikely history of hermit crab keeping. I'm Larisa Meeks, and welcome to CrabCon 2023. This presentation could have been called Pet Hermit Crabs, Victims of Gags, Gimmicks, and Greed. But as we travel down this history trail, I choose not to think of anyone as a villain, just a wide range of characters. I will focus mainly on the Caribbean or purple pincher hermit crabs as pets. The history covered also is primarily concentrating on Florida and the eastern U.S. coast. So when you think of 19th century naturalist, perhaps you think of John James Audubon, artist and ornithologist. Or maybe Beatrix Potter, renowned children's author of Peter Rabbit stories and a mycologist. Or maybe even Teddy Roosevelt, U.S. president and conservationist. But what about P.T. Barnum, the man known as a showman, humbugger, and fraudster, who is quoted as saying, "I am a showman by profession, and there's a sucker born every minute." Surprisingly, P.T. Barnum was friends with Henry Bergh, founder of the ASPCA, an unlikely friendship. But showmen and promoters are exactly who led the charge to keep hermit crabs as pets, many of whom thought they were naturalists helping children. Speculators, opportunists, the ill-informed, and the uninformed are who have continued the practice. To begin, we will look back into the 1800s, where hermit crabs were mentioned in books and newspapers, in much the same fashion as a bald eagle, perhaps a rarity in some parts of the country. Then, after the turn of the century, they were used for scientific study. And they were occasionally an amusement or an exotic pet. Sometimes they were used for food or fishing bait. Now we will look specifically at Florida, as this is where the documentation will take us. Between 1900 and 1940, Florida would see periodic land booms and growing tourism, specifically something called tin can tourism, also known as can camping. It originated in the early 20th century upon increased automobile access and as resourceful travelers repurposed mass-produced metal products into mobile accommodations during their journeys, giving birth to the modern concept of the RV. It was common for folks to pack canned foods for the journey too. Florida was also a playground of the uber-rich. Air travel was on the rise, and as seen in this British Pathé short film from 1933, people often used our small crustacean friends for their amusement. This example is the earliest film of hermit crabs I could find. Seems Americans, if not all humans, have a fascination with racing animals, or maybe just for betting. These are still shots from the 1941 film The Shadow of the Thin Man, in which small turtles can be seen racing at the bar. The Southern military camps and bases were useful to the war effort during World War II. War training in Florida and surrounding states introduced the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic Ocean, and the beach to military personnel. And after World War II, veterans returned to live in Florida or just to vacation. Additionally, there were other national factors laying the groundwork for the future hermit crab industry, such as the baby boom with the growing child population, the creation of the polio vaccine, making summer travel less scary for families with small children, the increased production of automobiles, a growing middle class, the construction of the U.S. interstate system, and eventually the opening of Disney World. In 1957, the children's book, Pagoo, about a hermit crab by Holling Clancy Holling, was released and covered in newspapers nationally. The 1950s and 60s also saw the beginning of fads, like the Frisbee in 1957, the hula hoop in 1958, and the Barbie in 1959. So just when did land hermit crabs become pets? In 1953, in West Palm Beach, Florida, a couple named Vince and Jenny Kloeb began selling pet hermit crabs at their seashell shop. This date is confirmed by their daughter's website and the FMR Pets or Florida Marine Research website. Despite being the first, the 1950s did not see the hermit crab become a national sensation for Mr. Kloeb. In addition to taking credit for being the first to sell pet hermit crabs, he also claims to have invented the wire cage, the hermit crab leash, and the invisible goldfish. Vince Kloeb began making the wire cages himself and made them to the exact size of a Maxwell House coffee can lid. In fact, Maxwell House would deliver truckloads of the lids directly to him. While in Florida, Mr. Kloeb worked with a man named John Root, a shell polisher who had begun business in 1944 and later became a wholesale supplier of hermit crabs himself. Kloeb also worked with a man named Mr. Moore of Florida Marine Research to increase his supply of hermit crabs. The family says that FMR was a struggling research company at the time. The name Florida Marine Research Incorporated wasn't registered with the state of Florida until 1977, but obviously seems to be connected to the Kloebs long before then. The Kloebs also had locations in Ocean City, Maryland, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and Nags Head, North Carolina. Later, his daughter Patty and her husband Tom Derrick opened the Seashell Shop in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. Note: Patty Derrick, the daughter of Vince and Jenny Kloeb, says the sponge was added by one of her employees as decor in the summer of 1980. It was cut into the shape of a ball, and they called it a Nerf ball for hermit crabs. It never had anything to do with their care. The 1950s and 60s saw advertising and promotions directed specifically to children, especially in ways that went around parents, such as TV and comic book ads. Comic books had taken off during and shortly after World War II, so much so that Congress decided to hold Senate subcommittee hearings in 1954 on juvenile delinquency, with a serious look into the role of comic books. This led to the Comics Magazine Association of America to establish the Comics Code Authority to self-censor. However, despite setting criteria for the comics storyline, this did not seem to apply to advertising. Hermit crabs were not heavily advertised in comic books until the mid-1970s, as we shall see later, but many other live animals were. Aquatic animals, ants, alligators, quail eggs, raccoons, lizards, chihuahuas, and monkeys, all sent to children by mail. And yes, there were some injuries reported. What could go wrong? There was a rise in the trend of having animals for fun and profit, too. Granted, much of it was like fur farming. Many people may remember sea monkeys in particular. This was the gimmick of a man named Harold von Braunhut, the owner of Trans Science LLC in 1957. He also sold invisible fish and X-ray specs. Von Braunhut took out an amazing 196 patents in his lifetime. However, the New York State Attorney General took exception with the invisible fish and went after him for fraud. A federal judge threw out the case saying, "Sponge cake is not a sponge, and butterflies are not made of butter." Von Braunhut also sold a strange self-defense weapon called the Cayuga, from which the proceeds were to be used for the legal defense of Richard Butler, head of the Aryan Nation. This is just so ironic when you discover that von Braunhut was actually Jewish and had added the von to his name to sound more German. His involvement with white supremacists wasn't just limited to this one time. He also helped purchase firearms for a KKK faction in Ohio. This eventually led to trans science being banned from comic book advertising, until just recently. On a fascinating side note, as von Braunhut's sea monkeys were competing with Whammo's instant fish, he did actually consult with Anthony D'Agostino at the New York Ocean Science Laboratory to selectively breed and create a perfect hybrid brine shrimp egg. But that was a business decision. During this time, media companies produced many classroom films that promoted pet ownership, such as City Pets, Fun and Responsibility from 1953, and Care of Pets from 1962. And Beginning Responsibility from 1951, with the lesson about what happens when you don't feed your tadpoles. Here is a clip from British Pathé's newsreel Boy Zoologist in 1958 showing a very dedicated child with his own zoo, which contained many of the animals available in comic books at the time. trends were everywhere, and toy companies even marketed animals, like Whammo's Instant Fish, as mentioned, and Uncle Milton's Ant Farm. In 1968, the gerbil became the IT Pet of the Year. Now, there wasn't a lot of information about hermit crabs as prizes, but live animals such as goldfish were used quite a bit by carnivals throughout the 20th century. I found during my research that even carnivals have lobbyists. Who knew? Anyway, back to live animals as prizes. Maybe it was Eddie Haskell logic. Get kids excited about winning a pet maybe they weren't allowed to have. Hey kids, just tell your parents you didn't buy it, you won it. In March 1969, a national newspaper article hit the wire service and went somewhat viral across the nation. Notice that the idea that hermit crabs won't reproduce in captivity was actually a selling point, especially compared to that it pet gerbil, or guppies. In the 1960s, turtles had become popular and had their own classroom films. Possibly due to improper care advice, it wasn't uncommon to have to replace your pet turtle. By 1970, it was reported that as much as 4% of households owned at least one pet turtle. There were over 60 million households at the time, meaning 2.4 million pet turtles minimally. But in May 1975, the FDA banned the sale of baby turtles 4 inches or smaller due to salmonella outbreaks. Some news reports stated 13 million turtles a year were being sold, a number far larger than the 4% of households. Soon, people were known to release the turtles into the wild or to flush them down the toilet. The ban prompted many pet stores and animal wholesalers to look for an alternative starter pet. A businessman named Woodrow Stetson had visited Florida and discovered pet hermit crabs. He returned home, and along with Bill and Martha Hulsenbeck, they began the Shell Shanty in Long Beach Island, New Jersey in 1975. Right as the FDA turtle ban was taking effect, and they would go on to be the major wholesaler of hermit crabs for decades. 1975 was also the big boon year for pet rocks, invented by advertising executive Gary Dahl, for which there was an instruction book over 20 pages long. For a rock. Then came 1976, the bicentennial and the kickoff to the hermit crab fad. Carol Orms purchased the legendary Jonathan Livingston crab in Ocean City, Maryland in August of 1976. It's unclear if she got him from the Klobes, Derricks, or Hulsenbecks, since they all had stores there. That same year, TransScience, the makers of sea monkeys, patented the name crazy crabs for terrestrial hermit crabs. TransScience seemed to suggest South American crabs were counterfeits and didn't live as long. I'm sure it had nothing to do with different care requirements. Their ad also recommended the customization of shells by painting them or covering them in rhinestones. Then, as it approached the 1976 Christmas season, TransScience hired publicist Jim Moran to promote the crazy crab. He had observed crab racing with the creatures under beer glasses in British Honduras. Jim Moran was a former Hollywood publicist known for outrageous stunts, such as traveling to Alaska to sell a refrigerator to an Eskimo for General Electric, or promoting the 1947 film The Egg and I by sitting on an ostrich egg for over 19 days. After failing to get a permit for a New York City stunt, he was quoted as saying, "It's a sad day for American capitalism when a man can't fly a midget on a kite over Central Park." Moran was really pushing hermit crabs as an easy pet that can live for 70 years, and you could take them anywhere. Because they aren't marine hermit crabs, he suggested keeping them on kitty litter. He said they could eat pizza, cookies, and cornflakes, or that they could go for very long periods of time without food or water. He says he sent his partner down to Puerto Rico to, quote, jazz up the crab snatchers. As an aside, during this time, a company called Nature Gems sold hermit crab paperweights, which contained preserved specimens. In addition to Trans Science, another big name in the 70s fad was the Great American Crab Company. They picked up steam right after the Christmas of 1976 in hopes of a repeat for the 1977 Christmas season.
They've been around for a while, but just recently have become popular with most people in the pet stores. They've essentially taken over the area where the little green turtles used to be real popular.
Why would anybody want one of these things in the house?
Well, they're very quiet, they're very clean, they take very little maintenance. If you wanted a perfect apartment pet, you couldn't ask for anything better. They require any type of food just about. They'll eat pizza to dog food to lettuce.
Robert, exactly how would you describe these things?
Well, I'm sure most people are familiar with the pet rock craze. Well, you could consider these moving pet rocks.
Don't really imagine you'll ever see the day when your crab will go fetch the newspaper in your slippers.
I doubt that too, but neither would your pet rock.
And just like that, almost all publicity on pet hermit crabs at the time pushed that they were safer than the illegal pet turtles and alive, unlike the pet rock. It was suggested that the hermit crab would make a great pet for lonely people. The Great American Crab Company initially would be quoted in newspapers as selling 5,000 to 10,000 crabs per week. They were sold in hundreds of stores throughout the U.S., such as Woolworths and JCPenney. More and more people invested in hermit crabs and businesses that sold supplies. They were considered the merchandising idea of the year for 1977. It wasn't unheard of to use hermit crabs for fundraising either. The Great American Crab Company hired Jerry Digney to help with the Marketing Blitz campaign. Mr. Digney was the appointed National Public Relations Director for Ringling Brothers, Barnum, and Bailey Circus. Great American Crab Company eventually claimed that sales were up to 15,000 crabs per day at this point. That would be over 5 million in a year. But they denied responsibility for the scarcity of the hermit crabs in Florida. There were advocates even early on. Middle schoolers questioned the idea of removing so many hermit crabs without impacting the environment and helped to make it illegal to remove hermit crabs from Florida. Bill Stobach, owner of Modern Trend Imports, claimed he imported his hermit crabs from South America at the rate of 1.2 million per month. That would be 14 million in a year. Meanwhile, the Great American Crab Company began expanding into Australia and Germany. They only appear in media from 1977 to 1979. That last year, they began to diversify into something called the Super Bowl, a fancy name for a soup bowl, before disappearing from news coverage. The Seashell Shop, belonging to the Klob and Derrick families, as well as the Shell Shanty, belonging to the Hulsenbecks, became big suppliers of hermit crabs. The Seashell Shanty would transition to wholesaling in 1986. While Patty Derrick and her husband Tom continued running the seashell shops started by her parents, Vince and Jenny Klob. By the early 80s, hermit crabs had become a traditional souvenir to many folks. Then in 1987, the Eric Carle book, A House for Hermit Crab, was published, bringing the hermit crab back to the eye of children. Many companies built their business on the hermit crab as a starter pet. Fluker's, for example, started in 1953 as a cricket farm and supplier of fishing bait. They began supplying reptile owners with feeder insects in the 1980s and expanded to a variety of pet supplies. When I reached out to them, they stated they began selling hermit crab supplies about 4 years ago. But there are instructional videos with their products on YouTube that are at least 8 years old. ZooMed began in 1977, focusing primarily on reptiles and amphibians before venturing into hermit crabs. As stated earlier, Florida Marine Research was licensed with the state of Florida in 1977 under the name of Paul Manger. But remember, there was a company by that name that worked with Vince Clow back in the 50s. If you have visited the FMR Pets website, it may seem a bit outdated by today's standards. Speaking of, in 1995, the internet took off. And in 1999, the Land Hermit Crab Owner Society was formed. But a variety of care instructions remained on the internet, and hermit crabs were often sold as classroom pets. Then, in the early 2000s, the hermit crab mall kiosk trend appeared. Around 2006, Bratz put out a hermit crab mobile kit in plastic shells targeted to children. Then in 2007, PETA began to focus on hermit crabs and bringing their plight to the nation's attention, first through op-eds and eventually through video. Whether as a result of Lycos and PETA's efforts or a shift away from retail pet stores, interest began to decline by 2010. When searching newspapers.com for the term pet hermit crab, you can definitely see the spike in the 70s and that it leveled off by the early 80s. There seems to be even more of a drop-off after 2010. By the summer of 2016, an article in Pet Age magazine, an industry-specific publication, acknowledged the lack of growth in the hermit crab industry. And they ran another article in the summer of 2017 educating pet stores on the variety of hermit crab products available and how to display them. Both articles included interviews with Florida Marine Research and other makers of hermit crab supplies. With declining malls, hits to tourism from COVID, the work of Lycos and Stacy Griffith, Mary Akers, Hermit House, and all the advocates, PETA's campaign, and the launch of Crab Central Station in 2018, a lot of progress has been made in educating the public on the plight of wild-caught hermit crabs. The impact can be seen in situations such as the Seashell Shop closing its downtown location in Rehoboth Beach earlier this year. Now down to just one location, the Seashell Shop had 5 locations at one time. But there is still more to be done to overcome the notion that hermit crabs are starter pets. You see web results or magazine articles produced by names like Good Housekeeping that continue to promote them as an easy starter pet. Unfortunately, there are media groups such as Expert Village Leaf Group that buy up old media and redistribute it on platforms such as YouTube, providing instructions on bathing hermit crabs and how to remove a crab from its shell. AI-generated responses may not be up to Lycos standards either, as seen here from ChatGPT that suggests just 5 gallons per crab and starting with a 10-gallon tank. There is a certain cartoon clip that comes to mind with the term starter pet.
My own little bunny rabbit. I will name him George, and I will hug him and pet him and squeeze him.
I'm not a bunny rabbit.
And pat him and...
You're hurting me. Put me down, please.
And rub him and caress him and...
I ain't no bunny rabbit!
So what are some new things we can do to help educate the public that hermit crabs aren't starter pets? In addition to supporting Lycos, Hermit House, and other hermit crab rescue groups, bring awareness to the term animal husbandry. While often associated with agriculture and farm animals, it really does apply to keeping any animal. The Animals at Home podcast has a wonderful episode on the subject. And we also have to deal with the idea of any kind of starter pet. All pets should be a family pet, not the sole responsibility of a child. When polling some of my homeschool families in the area, several suggested backyard chickens. But perhaps nature observations such as bird watching should be encouraged for children. It is definitely something that can either be low-tech or high-tech, with bird feeder cameras, and can include chores such as filling bird feeders. In addition to telling others that a hermit crab isn't a starter pet, perhaps you can also direct them to good husbandry YouTubers such as Serpa Design or Girl Talks Fish. Let's keep expanding our knowledge. Remember, hermit crabs replace turtles. Do you have more information about the history of keeping hermit crabs as pets? Feel free to email me at crustaceanpets@gmail.com. Maybe we can continue to build the story together. Please check out crustaceanpets.blogspot.com for a variety of links, including some from this presentation.